At the core, every ongoing podcast shares one theme: the ability to continue on successfully. The tricky part is understanding where that success comes from and how to exploit it to bring in more. Hello and welcome to another Podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. If Podcast Movement Evolutions 2020 had a theme, it's this: commercial viability is the new brass ring. Commercial viability. Viability, in and of itself, is something all podcasters, all podcasts, everyone involved in the process of podcasting should understand and work toward. Unconsciously, you already are. Something that is viable can continue on, continues to work, continues work successfully. That's the definition of viability. Continuing to work successfully at whatever it is. We're afraid of that word success in podcasting. But on stage, on the stages, in the hallways of Podcast Movement Evolutions 2020, held in Los Angeles, California last week, viability was the talk. Viability wasn't just the talk. Viability was on display. Viability was shown. Here we are, 16 years almost into podcasting, and viability is becoming the main talking point. And that's a little nerve-wracking for a lot of the legacy podcasters, those who've been doing it for almost 16 years. Hi. Even though we've all had levels of sustainability, it's never really been thrust, I don't think, in the face of podcasters the way it was over the weekend. And not just viability overall, because, look, podcasting must be viable. The thing you're doing right now that you've been doing for the last 8 years, 12 years, it has to be viable, or you wouldn't keep doing it. There's some amount of viability to it. But last week, that center was around commercial viability. And that's, again, like I said, a little scary to a lot of podcasters who haven't had to think too much about commercial viability. Commercial viability means that it pays for itself commercially. The thing you're doing, whatever it is, podcasting, business, you name it, well, and it's really a business. And it's commercially viable. Is your podcast commercially viable? I don't know. Not really the big question. I think for me, it was illustrated a few different times over the weekend. But one was when Dan Meisner from Pacific Content was on stage doing a presentation about a show that Pacific Content helped Red Hat develop and ongoingly produce called Command Line Heroes. You can listen to it if you want to. It sounds like a really great show. But he began his presentation with, a lot of people have this question in mind. How do I grow an audience for my podcast? Standard question. How do I grow an audience for my podcast? Dan at Pacific Content suggests we flip that on its head and say, how do I grow a podcast for my audience? How do I grow a podcast for my audience? And I think that at the core is what commercial viability means. It starts with having an understanding of an audience and building something that audience wants. It starts with actually having an audience is one of the big key factors why businesses like Red Hat, like a lot of the ones that we're talking on stage today, were successful at doing is because they already have an audience. What if you don't have an audience? Well, that's the big question. What if you just have an idea? Therein lies the challenge. Because if you have an idea for a show, you've got two paths I see that you can go down. One is the common one, the one that most people would tell you to do, is that take your idea for a podcast and just start. Grab a microphone. Get a hosting company. Start your show. That's it. That's all it takes. You've got your idea. Now you've got a podcast. But you'll notice you didn't start with an audience. So path number 2, if you've got an idea, is take that idea to the audience. Not the podcast. Take the idea to the audience. Shop it around. Ask questions. Do interviews. Really deeply get inside of the psyche of people to find out, is this something that they want? Is your idea viable to those people? Would it be something that they would add to their lives? And if so, go build that podcast. But what about those of you listening to me right now who say they've already got a podcast and it's not yet commercially viable? What do you do? How do you make your podcast commercially viable? I suggest to you that that's the wrong question. I suggest to you that you're, again, thinking of that same thing of how do I build an audience for my podcast? Maybe it's not commercially viable. And it doesn't have to be commercially viable. It just has to be viable. Maybe that's your first question. Do you want a commercially viable podcast? Again, it doesn't have to be. It can be viable because it gives you what you need and you're happy to fund it. It could be viable to a small number of people who are happy to give you enough money so you can keep paying your hosting bills and feel it's right for you to spend the time on it. Who knows, right? It's viable because you get enough time speaking on conferences and people who listen to it say, I'd like to invite you to come speak. Great, okay. But if that's not the case and you're wondering, why am I doing this every single day? It may be that you don't have a commercially viable podcast and that there may not be an easy way for you to transform your podcast into being commercially viable. And if that's the case, what can you make that might be commercially viable? Step back, reconsider, do something that is commercially viable. How do I do that, you might say? How do I know what's commercially viable? Well, I said it a minute ago. You take your idea and you shop it around to the audience that you think might want it. You don't just drop it out there and hope, although that might work for you. Dropping it out and seeing what happens, sometimes it works. That's fine. But a better way to do it is go do some research. Ask people what they want. Viability. Commercial viability was on display at Podcast Movement Evolutions 2020. I think it's going to continue. I've got more things to say on that. The ideas that I picked up from Podcast Movement Evolutions 2020, as well as this concept of being viable. I'm talking about it all week long. So in the meantime, go to ratethispodcast.com/podpunt. Leave me a rating. If you want to make sure that I bring you those ideas to help my commercial viability, go to buymeacoffee.com/EvoTerra. And if you have questions about your business podcast and its own commercial viability, get in touch. I'm sure I can help. evo@podcastlaunch.pro or go to simplermedia.pro to see a list of how we help businesses all around the world. More thoughts coming tomorrow on yet another podcast, Pontifications. Cheers!